and turn it over to Natalia.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Doug. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our fifth session of the 50th anniversary Pilgrim at Tinker Creek Read Along. We're so happy to have you again, as always, and looking forward to the wonderful and insightful discussions that I know that we'll have this evening. So for today's overview, we've got some upcoming events and a few other housekeeping items. A little bit of review for last week, and then we'll jump into the discussion of our current chapters 12 to 13. And just for a little flair on this slide, I added a quote that I really, really enjoyed. When I first understood that even January is not muscle enough to subdue the deciduous South. Anybody that's tried to hike a little off the path after, I don't know, some random mushroom or little, bird that you wanted to see knows it's still a tangle. We're finally climbing out of all of that with the coming spring, which is very wonderful. So we finally have dates, times, and a address for our April 5th Tinker Creek Nature Walk, and that'll be headed up by Rachel Pence and Mackenzie Brocker. Rachel, I think you all will fondly remember from our being our guest guide, I think 2 sessions ago, and she had the wonderful pictures and wonderful facts about the various bugs and such. And so they're going to be showing us and teaching us about some of the critters again, and it's going to be open to the rest of the community. So we'll have a version of this graphic in the upcoming newsletter. So yeah, April 5th, it'll be 2:30 to 4:30, thereabouts. And there's parking available here in this section of the Greenway. That's the new section of the Tinker Creek Greenway. So, and then a few more upcoming events. Still working on the specific location and time for the April 26th Mindfulness Walk with Suzanne. But the email listserv that Doug just mentioned, and that'll be on my next slide, we'll get that information to you ASAP, but it'll also be in the weekly arts newsletter, RoanokeArts.Tinker right here. And I've recently connected with Rachel Ann Morris for a mindfulness walking and writing poetry workshop, which is actually really, really sounds like a lot of fun. I'm really excited about it. We're still working on the date. We're thinking mid-April may be it, but it's possible that mid-May as well, after Daisy might be a good time. So again, you'll be the first to hear about it. So yeah, anybody that's chiming in via Zoom, if you wouldn't mind hopping into the chat and giving me your name and email. I realize we should have probably put together this list a little sooner, but better late than never. And then anybody that's in person, maybe if Doug, you said you've got a list that you're creating over there. Excellent. Thank you so much.
It's going around.
Awesome. And then anybody that's listening later, or just chat isn't coming up for you, or email would be your preference, just send me an email here at nataliamichaelart@gmail.com with your name, and then maybe subject line something like Tinker Creek email list, just for simplicity's sake. No need to put anything in there as the body. We just need your name and email. So thank you, everybody that's writing in on the chat. Really appreciate that. The other thing that I wanted to give you all was the link finally to the pictures that you all really enjoyed of the flood of 1985 that I should have included last week, but the link is a little complex. You could copy it if you wanted to, but Googling Roanoke City flood of 85 story map, that should give you, that should be the top result. It worked on my computer when I did that. And it's a really neat thing that the city put together where you just kind of scroll down and there's a bunch of pictures and like little facts and stories. And it was really, really interesting. And then here's that picture of Tinker Creek itself during that time. So finally jumping into a little more review. We have a few themes that emerged from last week's readings. Death versus meaning, nature persisting, overpowering, and I think another word that came up was inundation that I probably should have included, although I guess it is also a sort of synonym. Humbling in the face of that, overpowering. And as often appears as well, some disgust. So yeah, finally we're jumping into our first chapter, Night Watch. Um, I'm starting off with our grasshopper and locust example and passage. I really liked this one in particular. The world has locusts and the world has grasshoppers. I was up to my knees in the world. I felt that that was a short but good sort of illustration of where we're at moving into these two chapters. I'm sure it was purposeful, but I found it sort of fortuitous that in the sort of 50-page sort of chunks that we tried to divide the readings up into to make them more manageable, that we got 12 and 13 together, because I felt, and maybe you all will disagree, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, but I felt that they were pretty closely related thematically. Um, I felt that there was a lot of the sort of beauty and disgust once again, but we're maybe beginning to absorb some of those lessons from some of her past meditations and observations and bridge the gap a bit. And I thought that it was really interesting, sort of in that line of thought, that she starts us off with the sort of physical embodiment, maybe, of um, that kind of thinking, with the grasshopper becoming a locust in certain contexts, and that they are perhaps one and the same. And I say that only because I was looking for a suitable picture for this slide. And I tried to find one from a, properly documented, source that, seemed reliable. And it seemed to me like all of the recent examples were pointing to locusts being a separate species from grasshoppers. And I was going to put the question to you all if you knew better than me. I wasn't able to devote as much time to researching that as I wanted to. But at least in this picture, it says from the University of Cambridge. I pulled this off of a fairly recent study, an article about a recent study. And it says a solitary male desert locust here on the left is facing a gregarious male on the right. Gregarious is the fun term for when they turn into that sort of, I don't know, darker locust version of themselves and start forming swarm behavior. So yeah, does anybody know about locusts versus grasshoppers? If not, that's totally fine. I'll look into it and maybe I'll be able to get back to you next week. If anybody has any thoughts about sort of the beginning of chapter 12, please feel free to jump in. Twyla, yeah, please go right ahead.
If I could operate my phone a little bit better on Zoom, it would go quicker. I did find, because I was like, certainly grasshoppers are not locusts, right? So I did look this up, and this is what I found. So, yes, a locust is a type of grasshopper. All locusts belong to the grasshopper family, but not all grasshoppers are locusts. Which I don't quite understand, but locusts are distinguished by their ability to swarm under certain conditions. So I guess a locust can be a grasshopper, but a grasshopper maybe is not a locust at all, in circumstance. So that's what I found.
Okay, no, that sounds about right based on kind of what I was running into. Thank you so much for looking that up. Because yeah, I didn't want to say definitively without confirming that. So thank you so much, because yeah, I was a little confused.
You're-
Anybody else downtown or on Zoom have any thoughts? If not, I can
Well, I
move
just,
on.
I,
Oh,
I like at the top of that same page where, just back to that same, kind of the horribleness of the fecundity chapter. And when you think of locust, of course, you think of, the swarm. And, but at the top of that page, where she just says, they lay more egg pods than grasshoppers. They are restless, excitable, voracious. You now have jars full of plague, which just made me laugh. She just ends. She just has that way of so nicely closing something up with a little bit of wit.
yeah, she is great at doing that. All right, well, we can continue moving. Um, I also really enjoyed the passage with the little goldfinch. I really, really love this photo I was able to find. Maybe it's not quite as backlit at the sort of golden hour that it seemed like Dillard was describing in that particular scene, but still, just that hardworking little beak. Um, would anyone like to read the quote?
I can read it.
Sure.
The same fixity that collapses stars and drives the mantis to devour her mate eased these creatures together before my eyes. The thick, adept bill of the goldfinch and the feathery coated down. How could anything be amiss? If I myself were lighter and frayed, I could ride these small winds too, taking my chances for the pleasure of being so purely played.
Thanks so much, Rachel Ann. I picked this chapter. One, it struck me that, and I'm sure she's done this many times prior, but in these two chapters that we read for this week, she often compares the physical forms of the creatures that she's observing and meditating on to her own body. And I suppose, and that sort of led me down a line of thinking that that's a fairly natural sort of knee-jerk response. That's the way that we experience the world, and embodiment is such a big theme in the book as a whole. But I did also wonder if that contributes to some of that like visceral sense of disgust and her musings on the like the grosser, crueler aspects of nature that she describes. Um, but in this chapter, she also allows herself to go back to sort of enjoying the beauty of things. I think we got a lot of the ugliness, particularly in fecundity, and she seems to kind of have let herself drift back in the other direction. And I'd love to hear you all's thoughts on this as well, but I kind of imagined like this book being I imagine like a pendulum sort of where throughout the book the oh, what's the word I'm looking for? The space in between sort of going back and forth starts to grow smaller, and the pendulum will never rest in a particularly in an especially static position, but she may eventually find a sort of balance where the shift isn't quite so big. um yeah, I'd like to know your thoughts on that. Maybe I'm totally off base.
No, I think that's a really good metaphor, because I was thinking similarly that like things are kind of getting tied together. She's mentioning stuff that she mentioned at the beginning of the book, and like you said, the chasm is getting smaller. And I feel like I'm making more connections than I was in the beginning, and I think she, at least for me personally reading it, I know that in one of our earlier conversations, a lot of people expressed that her writing style was very disorienting. And I understand that sentiment. I didn't find it disorienting personally, just because I also spend a lot of time in nature and it just really reflects what it's like. But I think she did a good job for me reading this book, just like ushering me through, ushering the reader through this journey of like being able to witness all of it. Like, I think that I definitely romanticize nature. Like, if I'm getting really caught up in, the hustle and bustle, I'm like, oh, I wish I was outside or like hiking or whatever. And she really does a great job of not looking away from the really ugly stuff too. Um, and I feel like after having read this, I feel more comfortable, I guess, being uncomfortable with all of that and like being able to see all of it in its entirety and not just like the beauty of the goldfinch
Yeah.
and stuff like that. So,
Yeah. But there's also nothing wrong with also enjoying those beautiful images. And I think I didn't want to make the quote too long, but I think the paragraph just under this one, she quotes a section of the Bible in which this was, humanity's curse, that thistles and thorns will grow out of the ground. Or I need to find that page in particular. And she muses on, does the goldfinch worry about the thistle the same way that, we do? I really liked, Rachel Ann, what you said about being more comfortable being uncomfortable. That really stood out to me. And I was wondering if anybody else kind of felt that as we make our way through the book and sort of absorb her contemplations, because I hadn't thought about it until you said it, but I think that I kind of feel the same way.
I don't know if I'm more or less uncomfortable being uncomfortable, because maybe I already was that, but it's more I have an 80-page rule. Like, if I don't like a book after 80 pages, too many on the shelves, I got other things to read. So I really only hung in there because I wanted to come.
Well, thank
80
you. We
pages, I was
greatly
like,
appreciate it.
I don't love Out of Africa either, that movie. I thought, this is dragging on, and where is she going? And I don't have a great attention span for stuff like this. So, anyway, one of the lessons I've learned personally is, I'm kind of glad I kept reading, because it took last week the humanity of it, and then this week to start to see, it's not that I didn't think she was a great writer, but to be able to be in the present more and just find, not just appreciate it, but really see the beauty in her writing. And the way she started, this was my favorite chapter in the book so far, and the way she started with war language and the move to music and orchestra, I thought, that's fascinating. Like, I kept going back and rereading, and when she moved away from the war language, she mostly stayed away from it and really moved in to the orchestra and even the flights and tossings. And I thought that was really fascinating. And where she talked about, was it the frogs or the cicadas in my book, page 219, that she had heard them begin at twilight and was struck with the way they actually do, quote, startup, end quote, like an out of practice orchestra, creaking and grinding and all out of sync. And I thought, any of us who have hung in there with, watching youth orchestras and then,
Yeah.
compared to professional symphonies, it just kind of, it gave me a little chuckle. But really, what kind of took my breath away was, after reading all that, which I thought was beautiful, is on page 223 in my book. She says, and this gets a little bit to what I think you were saying, Rachel Ann, or maybe I'm just seeing something that's not there, but where she said, had this place always been so and I had not known it? And I thought, how many places in our lives and in nature in particular have always been so, and we've not known it. Like the poet Maggie Smith, who I get to see in person next week, speak about her new book. She had this, I think it was over the summer, but she may have used it before that. But it was over the summer when I first noticed on social media, saw the phrase where she talks about beauty emergencies. And that how often does she, so she starts to now, like one of her practices is stopping and claiming something even with her kids. It's a beauty emergency. We must stop. And so I thought of that when I read this. Had this place always been so, and had I not known it? I thought that was kind of a life-changing sentence for me, or question.
Oh, that's great. Well, I appreciate that you hung in there. Truly, it means a lot that you wanted to join us, and then it brought you to appreciating the book. Some through line between what Rachel Ann and Sherry both shared that did also occur to me. I admittedly ran out of time. I meant to add a few extra slides, but there is a passage earlier in this chapter where she talks about packing her canteen and everything that she needs to stay the night, and she passes by the uh, eroded hill where the mantis laid her eggs, and this place and that place, and it just struck me how familiar it seems now. And then the repeated use of um, language that calls back to other chapters. Like here we have fixity, the fixed. She talks about what can you do but just laugh in the face of it all. In this chapter, heaven and earth in jest. I don't know if there are other examples that stood out to you all, but the landscape of Tinker Creek and some of its denizens start to feel familiar here. And in these sort of the sort of duo of penultimate chapters, um, I'm sure that was purposeful, at least in my view. Anybody else has something to add, please feel free. If not, I can move on. Katie in the chat just says eels, dot, dot, dot. Yeah, that was a wild one. Everything I feel like every fact I hear about eels just makes it is always tempered by the fact that scientists still don't really understand eels, and they become more bizarre and otherworldly every time I learn about them. So this was another such instance.
Is it true that they uh all across the globe, like she's saying, they all go to that one spot? I had heard like a year ago, it was like they all go to the Bermuda Triangle or something like, and she referenced somewhere close, I believe. But every eel in the world has the same migration route to the same spawning ground.
I would imagine maybe different species have their own sort of place that they go to, but probably in some geographic area, like certain species, probably, yeah. I've
I
def
didn't look into it further, but I'm starting to understand it as all eels around the world will travel to the same location.
maybe I wouldn't know. If anybody else knows more about eels, feel free. Feel free to let us know.
Take a remarkable journey. It seems like it's all eels. Sargassos Sea in the Atlantic Ocean to breed, where they release eggs and sperm for external fertilization, after which they die. Like, no matter where the eel in the world is, they're all going to Sargassos Sea. Like you're saying, like the more you learn about them, it's like, are
The
they
crazier they
from
get.
here? Or is this like a meteor drop off kind of animal?
That's true. So, some thoughts for discussion I have up here in our next slide. I mentioned earlier that embodiment and physicality are a main theme throughout the book, and how one's place, what is one's place in the, as she calls, fringed tapestry of existence. I found here that parallel to beauty and disgust, which was really a focus in previous chapters, were the spiritual and the physical, or what she terms the real, throughout these chapters. Obviously, these were, uh, you know, features of previous chapters, but they seemed especially in the forefront here. And as I mentioned before with the locust example, that she seems to bridge those two things, the spiritual and the physical, and it's that fusion, the sort of coalescence, the wisdom of the pilgrim's journey, sort of beginning to round out um, her views just about the world, and like the beauty, the romanticism, the ugly. Um, So I was wondering if anybody else noticed this. Once again, please feel free to let me know if you disagree, and if there's any examples or passages, I'd love to hear them.
I just have a quick comment.
Hmm.
She's always seemed spiritual kind of throughout the book,
Hmm.
but really in the latter half, or yeah, the latter half of the book, and definitely these final chapters, she becomes more biblical. There's more
Mm.
biblical, and really more so in chapter 13 um than 12. So I don't know if anyone else, there was like in 13 she talks about biblical concepts of sacrifice, but you can see she starts really dotting in kind of biblical references where, I like I said, it's always to me been painted in her own type of spirituality, but then
Hmm.
she starts really pulling out the Bible verses. That's just how I kind of interpreted the writing in the final chapters.
No, for sure. I actually have that as a later slide, some of that biblical language, but we can always go back and forth. Um, Anybody else, feel free to speak up whenever, or if we're just looking through for some passages, we can.
Well, just on the religion, I found that fascinating too. So I did see the same thing. And then I went down this rabbit hole of like her spiritual journey in general. And apparently she was, from what I understand, this is, my 10-minute summation, trying to get as much information before tonight as possible, that she did identify as a Christian, I believe Catholic for a long time. But now on her website, her personal website, under religion, it says none. And
Mm,
I think there were some things that happened along the way to inform that. And I didn't have time to read into it, but it's interesting because this book, her biblical knowledge is profound, and
hmm.
the way she uses it is really sublime, almost the way. I just think it's really beautiful. So I just found it interesting that her religion is now none.
For sure, that had occurred to me as well, and it makes me think, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek came out very early in her writing career. So, she wasn't even 30 yet, if I recall. She's published a lot since then, memoirs and novels. I'm sure, if you were to read through her oeuvre and, listen to talks and articles, we could probably trace more of that spiritual journey. Because
Yeah, the next one she writes is in the Pacific Northwest, and it's called Holy the Firm. And it's very slim, but it's really based in a deep study of Julian of Norwich, the saint. So she really, it's a beautiful, hard read. And in fact, you can tell that some of Tom Gardner's writing was very much connected to that book as well. Yeah, they're like glimpses through this, where I feel like I could read more into it or have a conversation with her and try and parse it out a little bit. Like even, this I felt was, I had a smiley face by it, so I must have enjoyed it. Page 218 in my book, she said, in his famous Camping and Woodcraft, Horace Kephart sounds a single ominous note. He writes in parentheses, some cannot sleep well in a white tent under a full moon. Every time I think of it, I laugh. I like the way that handy, woodsy tip threatens us with the thrashings of the spirit. And that white tent under the moon and the thrashings of the spirit, I just feel like there's some, like, she's trying to say more than it appears on the surface. And then just in front of that, this is just my favorite part of the book. Can I just read a little bit?
Sure. No, I'd love to hear it.
This is on 217, and I bet somebody else out there loved it too. Earlier, a Bob White had cried from the orchard side cliff, now here, now there, and his round note swelled sorrowfully over the meadow. A Bob White who is still calling in summer is lorn. He has never found a mate. When I first read this piece of information, every Bob White call I heard sounded tinged with desperation, suicidally miserable. But now I am somehow cheered on my way by that solitary signal. The Bob White's very helplessness, his obstinate Johnny Two-Notedness, takes on an aura of dogged pluck. God knows what he is thinking in those pendant silences between calls. God knows what I am. Like, I'm going to pause. Even there, you can take that different ways. God knows what he's thinking, or God knows what he's thinking. But Bob White, somebody showed me once how to answer a Bob White in the warbling, descending notes of the female. It works like a charm. But what can I do with a charm circle of male Bob Whites but weep? Still, I am brutalized enough that I give the answering call occasionally, just to get a rise out of the cliffs and a bitter laugh. Yes, it's tough. That goes without saying. But isn't waiting itself and longing a wonder, being played on by wind, sun, and shade? Sorry, I had to read that whole passage. I just loved it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in the Raleigh Court Book Club, which is one of the groups that's excited about what's happening here. And the book we're reading, have you read this yet?
No, I can't be there Friday. So
okay, the book we're reading that we're going to discuss on Friday is a book about, it's called The Anxious Generation. It's a book about how the life of adolescence has changed because of smartphones. And there is a section toward the back that I just couldn't help but think of Tinker Creek. And I might read just a little bit of it. It's called Finding Awe in Nature. It's impossible to overstate the role that the grandeur of nature has played in human spirituality. Psalms 19 sings out, the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. And then here is Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1836 describing the effects of that handiwork when he walks in a forest. Can you all hear me all right on?
Oh, yes,
okay.
Very well.
And so Emerson says this, in the woods, these plantations of God, a decorum and sanctity reign. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air, and uplifted into infinite space, all meaning egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I thought that was interesting. I picture Annie Dillard as a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me, and I'm part of the parcel of God. And then the author goes on and says, in 2003, Dr. Kettner and I published a review paper on the emotion of awe, AWE. in which we argued that all is triggered by two simultaneous perceptions. First, that what you're looking at is vast in some way. And second, that you can't fit it into your existing mental structures. That combination seems to trigger a feeling in people of being small in a profoundly pleasurable, although sometimes fearful way. All opens us up to changing our beliefs, our allegiance, and our behaviors. And then he talks about his partner in this study has worked a lot with college students. And he and his students collected thousands of accounts of all experiences from people around the world and sorted them into the 8 most common categories, which he calls the 8 wonders of life. They are moral beauty, collective effervescence, nature, music, visual design, spiritual and religious awe, life and death, and epiphanies, moments in which a new grand and understanding dawns. Anyway, this goes on talking about how, and I just could picture Annie Dillard in awe a lot in this book, and how important all is. And he ends this section by saying, he tells how he has his students at NYU walk out into parks and just take nothing with them and just look, and all that they learn by that. And it says right at the end, if we want all to play a larger and more beneficial role in our lives, we need to make space for it. As a result of doing my own all walk in the same week my students did them, I now take my ear pods out of my ears when I'm walking in any park or natural setting. I no longer try to cram as many audiobooks and podcasts at 1.5 times normal speed as my brain can receive. As for our children, if we want awe and natural beauty to play a larger part in their lives, we need to make deliberate efforts to bring them or send them to beautiful natural areas without phones.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about if Annie Dillard had a cell phone with her while she was, I mean, I can go around my yard and take 25 pictures every day, but it's not, that's not really all. That's, I don't know what that is, but I just thought it was interesting from another book that I'm reading, that this whole idea of awe is a tremendously important part of life. And we probably don't spend enough time walking in parks, but when we go out by Tinker Creek, we'll be doing some of that.
No, thank you very much for sharing that passage. Perfectly. The definition of awe really does seem to encapsulate a lot about Tinker Creek. And it seems also like you've sparked some thoughts. Katie, I saw your hand up first. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I really like what we're saying about awe, and I've also heard that described as the oceanic feeling, sort of being made small by, I guess, what we would also call the sublime, and sort of being recipients of all that. And what Doug was reading also made me think of the final passage in this chapter, where she says, I cannot ask for more than to be so wholly acted upon, flown at, and lighted on in throngs, probed, knocked, even bitten. A little blood from the wrists and throat is the price I would willingly pay for that pressure of clacking weights on my shoulders, for the scent of deserts, ground fire in my ears, for being so in the clustering thick of things, wrapped and enwrapped in the rising and falling real world. So I thought that was interesting when we talk about spirituality versus maybe what's real or scientific, and how she really finally kind of weaves them together. And I think sometimes she's okay with not subscribing everything to one or the other, but kind of rather, I guess, using them as part of that collection that she has of things that inform her sense of what the world is and why or how.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, well, when you mentioned I'm really glad you brought up the word sublime because I was thinking about those paintings. I'm absolutely losing the term for the movement. But like Rothko and those that came shortly after, there's the big painting with the line going down it. Does anyone know what I'm talking about?
Like abstract expressionism.
Yes, thank you. I'm very familiar with the works, and then the names were just popping right out of my head. So thank you. Twyla, I saw that you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I was just going to continue the thought on awe and just kind of take it. There is one passage in this chapter, and it's on.
The book club are really excited about it too.
I think of how the author thought of it, and it was, she says, "This is what I had come for, just this and nothing more. A fling of a leafy motion on the cliffs, the assault of real things, living and still, with shapes and powers under the sky. This is my city, my culture, and all the world I need. I look around." So it is kind of that sense of awe. So I thought I'd share that passage because that's in this chapter.
And very much what was mentioned from the other book as well, of going in a walk in nature and just being there and looking. Yeah.
I also meant to mention that our book club at Raleigh Court Library is discussing this book, where I read that book from, this Friday at 1 o'clock, and any of you'd be welcome to join us. You haven't read the book, but if you want to hear the discussion, I've heard a number of members are real excited about what's in this book, so.
Great.
And I think his research partner, I'm in another group with Sherry, we read a book called Awe, and it was organized in
I
8
bet that's
sections.
his
I think it must be
partner,
his partner's book.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I've heard things about that book that you mentioned, The Anxious Generation. A really quick aside actually that occurred to me that I meant to that I was actually thinking about earlier today. With the email list that we're compiling, I wondered if maybe my first one that I'll send out to everybody, I'll solicit if anybody has any book titles, a few have come up thus far, of just, if you like Tinker Quick, you might like this one. You know, anything related ideas or just another thing on your, favorite book list that you think that the group might enjoy, we can come up with a little recommended reading for our last session. Just an idea.
I think it's a great idea. It'll be like an algorithm, but handcrafted with love by people who care.
That's a new and fascinating definition of a community.
Yeah.
All right. Really quick, I have a question in the chat. Should it be Roanoke-ish related? No, just anything. I mean, the one that comes to mind that I'm sure probably all of you have read would be like something like Braiding Sweetgrass, or the author's newest book, Serviceberry. I think, was it someone in a previous session mentioned the author that had a stroke and learned to see for a few months as she was recovering. So just anything that like comes to mind, I'll just put it forth to the crew if anybody's looking for something interesting to read. So moving on into chapter 13, it's a little later into the chapter, but this might have been one of my favorite passages, and I'll just go ahead and read it. I wonder how many bites I have taken, parasite and predator, from family and friends. I wonder how long I will be permitted the luxury of this relative solitude. Out here on the rocks, the people don't mean to grapple, to crush and starve and betray, but with all the goodwill in the world, we do. There's no other way. We want it. We take it out of each other's hides. We chew the bitter skins the rest of our lives. First of all, just a fascinating observation. And secondly, the latter half of it, I found, it rhymes like a poem. It's almost kind of out of left field, but really wonderful little addition. I just found it fascinating, this sort of fascinating turn that the language took there. And I can't help but think about, the background fact that we learned from Tom Gardner that first session, that it was, this book is organized from a collection of something like 1,000 note cards of her various little observations and experiences and collection of stories. So I wonder if, this part was just a little poem somewhere, and she's like, here's the right spot for it. And I wasn't sure what picture to put with it, so fellow gardeners know we like the parasitic wasps when these guys show up on our tomato plants. Anybody have thoughts, comments, related things to share before I move on? Like I said, this is partly, I want to say at least mid to late chapter 13. I didn't mean to skip over too much. So, if I'm going too quickly, please let me know. But we can just kind of go back and forth whenever. If you have a thought about chapter 12, just go ahead. Right. Well, if anybody has any thoughts, let me know. Go on ahead. I picked this one because it seemed to sort of contrast, but also really complement. That's sort of dark thought. I love how I think this happened also in the third chapter we read last week. The name is eluding me, where she leaves us off with a sort of more hopeful note, or yeah, just a sort of lighter to lift, I don't know, lifts the spirit a little bit. She talks about being nibbled and damaged a little bit just in the course of life. The only way I can reasonably talk about all of this is to address you directly and frankly as a fellow survivor. Here we so incontrovertibly are. We can look around as those who are nibbled but unbroken, from the shimmering vantage of the living. Here may not be the cleanest, newest place, but that clean, timeless space that vaults on either side of this one is no place at all. Your fathers did eat manna in the wilderness and are dead. And I think just prior to this, she talks about how really the only undamaged, perfect beings are, babies, the newborn, those which haven't existed for very long at all. And the blog that I found this lovely photo of the Eastern tiger swallowtail. I really liked the caption that the author put under it, so I included it as well. It says, an aging female Eastern tiger swallowtail held on long enough to enjoy the Joe Pye weed in full bloom. In the chat, Katie writes, the young man proudly names his scars for his lover. The old man alone, before a mirror, erases his scars with his eyes and sees himself whole. From page 239. Yeah, that one jumped out to me too.
There's no getting out alive or unscathed in the meantime.
But then going back to what we spoke about earlier in our discussion, that being wholly acted upon, that's something to revel in.
Mm-hmm. And at the same notion, now that you mention it, the young man is the one who proudly kind of revels in his scars. But the old man has to look past them to see himself whole again. Yeah. It is a wonderful perspective if you can turn your battle wounds into um lovable tattoos and wear them like badges.
think my next slide I've got, oh, after this I have my sort of discussion question I was going to put forth to you, but everybody, as always, feel free to interrupt me with your thoughts whenever. But this is the final paragraph of chapter 13, and I really wanted to hear what you all thought about it because it felt very pivotal to me in a way. But I have my own thoughts on it, but I'd like to hear yours. I'll just read really quick. I am a sacrifice bound with cords to the horns of the world's rock altar, waiting for worms. I take a deep breath. I open my eyes. Looking, I see there are worms in the horns of the altar like live maggots in amber. There are shells of worms in the rock and moths flapping at my eyes. A wind from no place rises. A sense of the real exalts me. The cords loose. I walk on my way.
Really good poetry. I see that as a painting, a kind of like a perverse painting where there's equal beauty and tragedy both exposed. But
It is very evocative imagery. Yeah. To
but
me, it gives
provocative, thank you.
yeah.
But the cord's loose and she walks on her way. I didn't expect that to be the final sentence. I don't know why. I don't know why.
Yeah, what does everybody think of the sort of like unshackling here?
There's kind of an acceptance here that I experienced reading this, and it of just accepting things the way that they are. Like I think there are multiple points in the book where she says, you know, here we incontrovertibly are. And it's very present. And on the previous page, at one point she's like describing, you know, the brokenness of nature and the line, I have to love these tatters, just really struck me. Because it feels almost not dire is not the right word, but it is dire. Like I have to. I live in the world and I'm of it and I have to love it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to love it as it is, because I can't change it.
It struck me that it was a choice, not just to end it that way, because I find it somewhat I found it unsettling, and I kept going back on, wait, did I read all this right?
Yeah.
And so what comes before the cords loose, I walk on my way, I've read this phrase over and over, a sense of the real exalts me. And that's a choice, to let a sense of the real exalt you. And then, so I go back and I look back at when she said, your fathers did eat, that your quote that you had on the other page, your fathers did eat manna in the wilderness and are dead. And I have spent a fair share of my adult life in studying the Bible and religion, and I hadn't read this particular version, like this particular translation where it's like are dead, present. And I actually went and looked it up and thought that is not there. And so as I kind of went through the different translations, I thought, oh my gosh, I've never seen it that way. And
Oh, interesting.
get to that point. I mean, it's clearly there. It was just it kind of hits you in the face when it says are dead. It just felt very.
Right.
So I went back and kind of thought, well, how did she get there? And the last sentence in the preceding paragraph to that, what she was talking about people and how people don't mean to grapple, to crush, starve, and betray, but with all the goodwill in the world, we do, there's no other way. We want it, we take it out of each other's hides. We chew the bitter skins to the rest of our lives. And then to the people ate man in the desert and are dead. and then fast forward that to this like those are very real things, very real. And then to move to this last sentence, the real exalts me. I think, wow, that's really a choice to get there. And I have to think about that more. I mean, it's beautiful. It's like worth pondering for longer than the time I had from the time I read this on my lunch hour to now.
Yeah, I'm a retired pastor, so I have an unusual interest in the spirituality here, but you know, a lot of religions, when people are serious about talking with God or figuring out what's going on in their lives, go off alone, like Annie Diller did. I mean, you know, she doesn't have anybody camping with her and along Tinker Creek. And I think that alone sense, which is sort of in this quote too, is really the most powerful way to connect with the divine, whatever you think that is. Because when you're surrounded by TV and people and all that sort of thing, it's hard to focus. Whereas to me, she really took a long time sitting on, and her description of how she tried to be so still in awkward positions to try to get a look at the creatures and that sort of thing is a spiritual practice, really. And I think, in my experience at least, amazing things happen when you take that time and get away from it all and have time to think who you are and what you believe and that sort of thing.
I mean, she has anecdotes throughout the entire book about, you know, amazing things that she sees that she has to go research later, you know, if it was even possible, like the mosquito landing on the snake, I think, in chapter 12. But yeah, no, I love hearing that many of you have strong knowledge of the Bible. Because that's, I think, actually my next slide is I wanted to bring up some of that religious imagery in particular. But really quick, the part that really struck me about this being a sort of pivotal turn is the last part. The cord's loose and I walk on my way. I could only think of the title as being a pilgrim, and you know the verbiage like altar, the title of the chapter itself. She was a physical pilgrim walking up and down the creek, a sort of spiritual one as she is with the creek. And I almost wonder if she felt, I don't know, as if her ideas about nature were a sort of altar, and in submitting to a different truth, she is freed by it and can continue on a new leg of her journey. That's sort of the image that I got, but it's powerful and ambiguous, and I'm sure that, you know, everyone's takeaway is.
Well, if you go back to that slide.
Yes. Oh,
you know,
sorry.
Thinking about,
there we go.
Thinking about the saints and her, and she mentions Julian in here, I think in the last week. And, you know, saints typically had some experience and they spend the rest of their lives trying to communicate, you know, think about it, live within it, understand it. And I don't, looking at this now, I don't feel like we can look at this in any other way than a spiritual, you know, event for, in the beginning of the book, she talks so much about the tree with the lights in it. And then just prior, and I'm looking at that second to last sentence, a wind from no place rises, a sense of the real exalts me, the cord's loose, I walk on my way. And on the page prior, she says, all right then, but knowledge does not vanquish mystery or obscure its distant lights. I still now, and will tomorrow steer by what happened that day. when some undeniably new spirit roared down the air, bowled me over, and turned on the lights. I stood on grass like air, air like lightning coursed in my blood, flowed in my bones, swam in my teeth. I've been there, seen it, been done by it. I mean, it really feels like a mystical experience that she's trying to communicate there.
Yeah, and I think in many ways, in our society, the church has it all wrong. We want people sitting together on pews on Sunday morning when in fact it would be more helpful to be out walking along Tinker Creek. I mean, religions around the world have stressed being alone and being apart, not sitting on a pew. So early saints would attach a little building onto the church, but they were sitting in that little building. They weren't inside the church. They were in that little space.
I learned about those recently, actually. Do you know what they're called? I can't remember the name of anything today.
What did she say?
I'm not sure. I was still.
No, actually, I think she mentions it actually in one of the early chapters. It was a word I hadn't encountered before, and so I looked it up and I learned what it was. It's wonderful that you bring that up because that's where it was. I'll see if I can find it. Let me make a note. Just for next week.
And I mean, another spiritual practice you do alone is walking a labyrinth. I mean, that's and we have some labyrinths here in Roanoke. And there again, you're alone. You're not, nobody's singing with you, no one's preaching to you. You're just listening. Which is what certain, well, like the Catholic, nuns and priests, they're really into that sort of thing too, but I don't think we give it, a lot of us don't give that activity credit. And I just feel like Annie Dillard was not only looking at nature, but on some sort of spiritual journey too.
Yeah.
Alone.
Yeah, I mean, there are people that, secluded monasteries, people that take vows of silence, silent retreats even. So, yeah. So really quick, I see we're nearing time. We have talked about this a lot, but there really is very heavy religious language. I mean, I started listing a few examples to try to include here, and then flipping through the 2 chapters, I just kept finding more and more and more. Something being a thorn in the side, the stalopsized bee being transfigured, just so many things. And I was curious what you all might think about why that is and why she would do that from a structural perspective, or another perspective if there's something I missed. Like why she would structure it that way, especially the sort of like as we're nearing the end of the book.
I love this question. It's interesting because there is definitely more like overtly religious language towards the end of the book. But for me, the book starts very spiritual. Like it's very present and grounded there for me. And maybe that's just based on my own like life experience. I attend the Quaker meeting, and so I spend a lot of time in meditation and stuff. And so I'm more tuned to see it. And I feel like a lot of this book is her inviting us and teaching us a little bit how to see, which she talks about earlier in the book too. And so from a structural perspective, it makes sense that it would get more overt as we get closer to the end of the book, because we are seeing more, so like we're more attuned to seeing after being invited to pay attention for however many pages we've read so far, over 200. But yeah, I love that question.
Oh, thanks. Well, no, that's a really great point. And as I mentioned earlier as well, like even the landscape we're more familiar with. So yeah, it's just sort of these many threads, to use her metaphor of the tapestry, or starting to coalesce a little bit more and maybe become clearer. Yeah, that is interesting.
Well, it might have been too that had there been too much of that stuff in the beginning of the book, many people would have just closed the book and thought, this is not for me, but
A good point.
we learned to trust her through through the journey, so by the end, she could say things and we'd take them more seriously.
Mm.
Cause now we know her and we appreciate her and.
The book was modeled after Thoreau's Walden. Does his book also get onto religious themes?
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Walden, does Thoreau do the same thing structurally?
I don't recalling him getting very religious from what the parts that I've read.
Yeah,
Thoreau, yeah.
yeah.
We'll have to add that to the list.
Mystical in a way, but not religious, yeah.
Yeah, that'll be at the top of our reading list. Because I actually haven't read it and now I'm pretty interested.
I mean, I almost think this book, I read some quotes from you from, that stuff was pretty well toward the end of the book. I mean, and I would think there's probably a literary advantage to having drawn readers in far enough that they might listen to things that they wouldn't have listened to in the beginning of a book. I don't
That's a
know.
good point, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Actually, on the topic of Thoreau's Walden, this is a bit of an aside, and I know I'm the facilitator, so I shouldn't be taking us down a tangent. But I did wonder, and I couldn't figure out if it was real, but I think it's chapter 12 when she goes to visit the like rundown cottage, the Lucas place. I couldn't find if any information as to whether or not that was a real place. Because she does, Tom Gardner told us that she sort of borrows and occasionally invents anecdotes to sort of as a sort of literary device to thread things together. And I wondered if that was supposed to be a reference. She does cite Thoreau a lot. I don't know, but if anybody finds out, I would love to know. Yeah, before we wrap up, any thoughts about these chapters that maybe we weren't able to get to in some of the previous discussions, passages you really enjoyed? It could be chapter 12, 13, anywhere in there. Just, Doug shared the one about the the poor unmated bird that he enjoyed. So please feel free, anybody, to jump in.
I wrote down a quote that was, toward the end of the first chapter we read, and she's saying, just a glimpse, Moses, a cliff in the rock here, a mountaintop there, and the rest is denial and longing. You have to stalk everything. This is in the stalking chapter. Everything scatters and gathers, everything comes and goes like a fish under the bridge. You have to stalk the spirit too. You can wait forgetful anywhere, for anywhere is the way of his fleet passage. And hope, oh, she's talking about not the groundhog, but in the water.
Muskrat.
Yeah, the muskrat. And if you hope to catch him by the tail and shout something in his ears before he rests away, and occasionally the mountains part and surely the Lord is in this place and I knew it not, she says.
Maybe she's talking about the muskrat.
Yeah.
So wait, you said that was, sorry to interrupt you, but you said that was in the stalking chapter?
I think so.
It's in that,
Let me
yeah.
see, in my book, 205.
Really
And,
quick, just because she does, I think,
Oh.
in
Yeah, it's right at the end, 205 in my book is at the end of the stalking chapter.
okay. Because yeah,
Um,
she repeats that phrasing, you know, I think there's a passage like life always catches you by the tail or something like that. So already this
Yeah,
book is asking me to reread it. See what I
now that
missed.
I look for it, I only see the part about the, surely the Lord is in this place, but it was in there somewhere that.
and didn't it start with a reference to Moses? and
Yeah, it started with the reference to Moses,
Who-
of
who-
204.
Who had to climb Mount Sinai alone?
Yeah, in my book, Moses is on the page before. Moses says to God, and they're talking back and forth on Mount Sinai. And then, yeah, this is at the top of page 205 in my book. Yeah, you hope to catch him by the tail and shout something in his ear before he rests away. Or you can pursue him wherever you dare, risking the shrunken, and she goes on and on about pursuing the muskrat.
Well, I guess she's describing a pilgrimage rather than sitting and waiting for the divine spark to act on you as she's uh you know, you have to seek it out. Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, like I said, I missed that, and then having read through and poured over sort of 12 and 13, now that makes
It's in that
true
same
meaning a little
paragraph.
more.
She talks about John Knopfler's poem, and Christ is Red Rover, and the children are calling, come over, come over. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, it's unfortunately 16. So I think we'll have to wrap up in short order. But thank you everyone for sharing and for all of your wonderful discussions, insights. Always love hearing your thoughts. So next week is going to be our final book meeting, at least to discuss Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, but we have our other upcoming events, taking advantage of the hopefully nice upcoming spring weather. We will probably be looking for some rain dates for everything we have planned. So we'll keep you all posted regarding that. But our next meeting is going to be April 8th. And yes.
Natalia, did you and Katie settle on a date for that fourth event?
I think we were looking at April 22nd, but I had a few questions for Katie. If you don't mind, I'll email y'all those later, just so I can give everybody accurate information.
Okay, not even a teaser, huh?
I'm sorry. No. Here, we'll go ahead. Katie, if you wanna hop in. Katie Brooks works at the Science Museum with the planetarium. She can tell you more about it, but we were looking at maybe April 22nd, which is an upcoming Tuesday, taking over sort of the Arts Connect Tuesday slot, because we don't have any other programming planned for that time. And yeah, Katie, if you have anything you'd like to add.
Sure. And yeah, feel free to ask me any questions. So I guess if we were doing April 22nd, we would be looking at like 6 or 7, or something in that range. And
Yeah.
it's just kind of an open invitation, the way I'm thinking of it now, and maybe we'll get more concrete when we talk about it. But we have some sort of meditative, more nature-oriented pieces that are short form. And one in particular, Doug really wanted me to show you all, which is about the spongy moth, or what used to be called the gypsy moth, which is actually featured in this book.
Yeah.
And kind of a different approach to that sort of art and science overlap that Dillard gives us so richly.
Well, that sounds really amazing. I like the sound of the moth. And I'm sure that would be interesting too. But yes, we'll talk more about it. But right now we're penciling in April 22nd, probably, as Katie said, 6 to 7. So we'll let you all know ASAP via the new list, email list, and then the weekly arts newsletter, and then the Roanoke Arts / Tinker page. So we'll try to get everything out there for everybody wherever they is easiest for them to check. So really quick, our next reading is going to be pages 243 through 271, and those last two chapters, Northing and the Waters of Separation. And as you're reading, think about what are your thoughts on the final chapters, and then as the book as a whole. I imagine we'll be talking a lot about just sort of the whole piece, what your thoughts are about it. Because having finished it, you can finally sort of gosh, I'm missing words, but you know what I mean. We'll discuss the work as a whole. So yeah, sorry, we're running a little over time, so I'll let everybody go. See you all next time, April 8th, same time as always, 7 to 8:15. So happy reading, and thank you all again. We'll see you all next time.
Good night,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.
So we don't meet next